So overall, looks pretty good, but there's still definitely some room for improvement as far as some of the lighting, some of the shadows, and just some of the overall qualities of this image. So one of the things that I would like to do is to maybe just add a little bit more of a lived-in feel to this environment. You can see we've already sort of taken those steps with little elements like this little power outlet, towel draped across the chair, but overall this still is missing at least some sense of age. You know, typically if this were going to be an outdoor environment, you would start to get, you know, very, very slight amounts of dirt that would start to collect in some of these little cracks, crevices, little bits of moss and other elements that might start to collect up along the top of these bricks as these plants are being watered, things like that. And again, these are things that, as you look at it, your eye may not even notice. But by not having those elements there, it, to your eye, just seems like something is missing, even if you're not even consciously aware of what that may be. So let's come in and just try to add a little bit more of the wear to this wall. So I'm going to start with just a new layer. I'll switch to my brush tool, press and hold the Alt key on my keyboard, and I'll try to sample sort of a dark green color from these leaves. There we are. And now, go into my brush editor, and make a few little adjustments here. So as far as the overall brush that I want to use, you can really go for anything that you want, something that's going to give us sort of a very, very subtle little texture here. So you can tell my brush is obviously way too large, so we're going to have to bring that way, way down. Okay, let's also maybe turn off something like my shape dynamic, so that way the brush isn't changing too dramatically as I'm making my strokes. This would really only apply more if you were using a drawing tablet, which is what I am currently using. And also maybe introduce a little bit of scatter into this, so that way as we start to make our strokes, we start to see maybe a little bit more scattering in here. At the moment, I have my flow turned way down. There we go. So now we can actually start to see this. So again, with something like this, subtlety is going to be really, really important. So I'm going to start with a nice small brush size. And on a new layer, so that way I can make sure that I'm not doing anything destructive, I'll come in and just start to very quickly just kind of work my brush back and forth on a few of these areas. Looks like my spacing may be a little bit higher than what I would want. So I'm just sort of playing around with some of these settings until I find something that is maybe going to work a little bit better for me. Again, keep subtlety in mind as you're going through this, and you'd probably want to take a little bit more care and a little bit more time than what I'm doing, but I'm just running through this really quickly just for demonstration's sake. So I'm just kind of running across here, adding what might appear to be some dirt or some moss or mold, things like that, that would probably accumulate in areas where maybe you don't have a lot of sunlight hitting those areas, or where you have lots of moisture from these plants being watered, things like that. So just very quickly coming through here, and like I said, you'd probably want to take a little bit more time, a little bit more care than what I'm doing. And you could take this as far as you want, but keep in mind that if you try to push this too far, then you can, again, kind of sometimes take your image maybe a little bit too far, and then your eye starts to notice things wrong with it for different reasons. Maybe because you've pushed things a little bit too far or added a little bit too much additional things onto this. So we want to keep this nice and subtle for our purposes. So again, just sort of running through here very, very quickly, trying to kind of think about where mold and some of this stuff would start to collect. More than likely that's going to be sort of in the cracks between these stones, so kind of in these mortared areas is where I'm running this brush a little bit more heavily and putting a little bit more of this dirt into. And the great thing is, because this is on a different layer, we can always come back and make adjustments to this and maybe go back and erase parts of this if we find that this is a little bit too much, or if we've gone a little bit too overboard with this. Okay, so we can start with something like that. So compared to what we had before, you can see if I turn that layer off, but it just, again, kind of helps add a little bit to that. Now, as I mentioned, that may be a little bit too heavy, so by having that on another layer, we can always start to adjust the opacity. We maybe want to dial that down and make that a little bit more subtle. Now, another thing that we'll probably have is, as I mentioned, things like dirt and dust that would start to collect in some of these little corners here. So, again, on a new layer, let's come in and just quickly run my brush through here. That's a little bit too much. So I'm going to start with a nice low flow here. Here we are, and just very, very gently run my brush back and forth, kind of along this little corner where the patio and the wall would start to meet up. And again, you can see sort of where my mouse has been, sort of back behind here, that's creating just a little bit of a discoloration right where this wall and the patio would meet up. And again, this is going to be something that we would typically expect to see in an outdoor environment. Now, how far you want to push this, again, that's entirely up to you. Usually, when it comes to working with things like this, it's a little bit safer if you're a little bit unsure of whether or not you've got too much or too little. I find usually it's a little bit safer to kind of err on the side of having maybe too little. Because again, sometimes having too much of this can be worse than not having enough. So, again, we can push this as far as we want, but I'm just going to run my brush back and forth across maybe just a couple of these steps, just for demonstration's sake. So, working that back and forth. And we can call that pretty good. We may want to come in here and maybe run that across back over here, where we see a little bit more of that wall meeting up with the patio. Now, because this is on a separate layer, we can always come back and maybe with our eraser tool, we could come back and try to erase away some of these areas if we find that we've gotten a little bit too careless with our brush strokes. All right, and one last thing before we wrap up this lesson is let's maybe add just a few little sprigs of grass that may start to grow up from some of these cracks. Again, if this was going to be an outdoor environment, fairly well lived in, you would probably expect to see maybe just a tiny little sprout of grass that's sort of popping up from grass seeds and things like that that would start to accumulate in here. So again, with something like this, subtlety is going to be very, very important. So I'll try to come in here and sample kind of a nice dark green color. For this, we may want to start to kick up our flow because we're going to want that grass to be a little bit more prominent now. So sometimes it may take a few tries and a few little different experimentations until you finally find a combination of brush, pressure, and opacity settings that will work well for you. Again, subtlety is very, very important with this. So maybe just a few little sprigs of grass here. There we are, something like that. Maybe in the corners, maybe a sprig or two, where we might expect to see maybe just a blade or two coming up from the concrete. And again, because that's all on its own layer, we could always come back with our brush or maybe even our select tool. If we find that maybe some of our grass blades have gone a little bit too low into this patio, we could always come back, select those, press the delete key on our keyboard or the backspace key. There we are. We can trim those back. Okay. So, looking at this, we've now come in and added maybe just a little bit more life to this image, a little bit more of a lived-in feel. So if we compare this to what we had before whenever we first opened up our image, again, you can see just a little bit of extra life compared to what we had before. So in our next lesson, we're going to come in and start to adjust some of our lighting and make a few final adjustments to some of the various elements of this image.